This topic introduces us to the major plant groups. These groups would apply to plants worldwide, but we're going to focus more intensively on plants you can find in Wisconsin. And it's important in the field to have a feeling for first identification, being able to put something into a category on really basic level, knowing what you've got, if it's a plant or not a plant, for example. And this first one is an illustration of a plant that throws a lot of people, if they're not familiar with it. It doesn't really look like a plant. It's ghost white, goes by the common name of ghost pipe, but it's actually kind of a close relative of blueberries. And it just happens to have lost the ability to do photosynthesis. It's lost its green pigment during the process, but otherwise it has leaves, it produces flowers, it makes fruits and seeds, and fits right in with the flowering plants. So we won't find too many exceptions like this, but I kind of like to get your thoughts going by introducing something like this that's a little bit out there. So overall, when I treat the plant groups, I like to cover them in these broad categories. The way I define the groups, they've got some more technical names, and I try to avoid the technical names because it's maybe just something that's not familiar to people. And it's also not terribly informative, right? If you know what a manila phyte is, you're probably pretty familiar with plants already. But these terms, I'm hoping maybe get you a little more of an entry level familiarity with the plant groups. We can still talk about the same groups and just kind of bear in mind that they have more technical names beyond these names. But these categories help to define what they have as far as features, and these can be features that are useful for identifying them. So when we talk about plants, we're talking about the land plants, the so-called land plants or embryophytes. And these are the ones that, these are the four major groups. And as I talked in the morphology section, the morphology lecture, we're going to focus almost exclusively on the flowering plants. And for a big reason, owing to the fact that there are just so many flowering plants in Wisconsin relative to these other groups. So the first two on there, non-vascular plants and ferns and relatives, those we will kind of barely cover. We don't run into too many ferns in southern Wisconsin, and the non-vascular plants can be a little difficult to identify. So certainly on your own time, you can get familiar with those and come back around to them. So in this lecture, I will introduce you to those groups, but we won't really get any practice identifying them. There are whole separate resources devoted to identifying ferns and mosses and things like that. But if we do run into a fern in the field, we might give it a shot. So these are the relative numbers of genera. So classification, category, genus, plural is genera. And this is one way to look at diversity. So how many groups are there out there containing these different species? So it's kind of a measure of broad diversity within these groups. And I'm not interested that you learn numbers. The numbers are just numbers. They do change. Sometimes plants get categorized. We might have new plants show up in the flora of Wisconsin. And so, memorizing 778 genera of flowering plants, that might not serve you in a couple of years. In fact, it might be outdated already. So I don't worry too much about that, but I'm more interested in relative numbers. So relatively, we have the most number of flowering plant genera. The link on here goes to the Flora of Wisconsin Herbarium website. We'll be visiting that a few times during this course. I won't really visit it in detail right now. Feel free to check that out on your own sometime. It's a resource that helps to kind of keep track of all the species we have in the state, certainly belonging to these ferns and relatives, conifers, and flowering plants at least. So I mentioned that we've got four categories defined by the features that they have. I define them by the features they have and the features that they don't have. And it turns out that with just a couple of features, you can place your plant into a category. So we have first feature that is present in some but not all is the ability to conduct water. So this involves having specialized cells for transporting water up from roots into the leaves and higher stems. And these plants called the non-vascular plants, including the mosses, they don't have specialized cells. It's certainly not the same kind of specialized cells as the other land plants. And as a result, we tend to see them a little bit shorter in stature. So they're not typically very big plants. They tend not to grow in drier places, although you can find them interestingly in some dry places sometimes. Um, you might see them in shady places. They have a bit of an advantage growing in areas where they don't need, say, to anchor themselves with roots. So they might grow in shady, sandy places. That's a pretty good moss habitat. Also shady, moist places in forests and so on. And they have the ability to dry out pretty well and survive that in a way that a lot of our vascular plants can't. The rest of the plants on here, the ferns and relatives, the conifers and the flowering plants, those all have specialized vascular cells for transporting water from their roots up to higher parts of the plant. That means they have veins in their leaves that are pretty obvious to see for the most part. And that means that they can grow generally bigger than our non-vascular plants. The other feature for telling these groups apart is the method that they use to disperse. So we won't go into detail on the life cycles. The life cycles of land plants are all related. They have a common ancestral life cycle that diversified into some interesting variations in the groups. But for our purposes, we're going to just consider the fact of whether you could find spores or seeds as a dispersal mechanism. So dispersal, plants are anchored in the soil for the most part. And when they need to get around, this is the main mechanism for dispersing and starting a new plant. So the non-vascular plants and the ferns and relatives, they disperse using spores. So this example image here of the ferns, this shows some dots on the underside of fern leaves. And those are clusters of spore producing structures. And that's how these ferns get around. So that's a natural reproductive part of the plant. And you would not find seeds produced by the ferns. You wouldn't find flowers or anything like that. Now, these other groups, conifers and flowering plants, they kind of traded in their spores for pollination as part of their life cycle. Both of these have pollen and ovules, and as a result of their fertilization, they produce seeds. So conifers, I use this just common term, conifer means the cone-bearing plants, so pine cones and things like that. Those contain seeds inside of the pine cones. The flowering plants have seeds, as we saw in the reproduction lecture, reproductive morphology, seeds that are produced inside of fruits. So there's a little bit distinction between these two groups, conifers and flowering plants. The flowering plants obviously have flowers. They also have fruits, and those are missing from the conifers that have what we call naked seeds. So they just fall right out from these cones in a way that's a little bit different than what fruit would do. Okay, so we'll go into these groups in a little bit more detail. As far as the non-vascular land plants, I'm mostly interested that you just are familiar with their names and the fact that they're reproducing by spores. Mostly in the non-vascular land plants, those consist of mosses, but also these other groups are present, liverworts and hornworts. You can kind of see from these images, these are plants growing in moist areas, growing relatively close to the ground. And that's kind of their niche habitat. That's a good place for these plants to do well. As far as diversity, there's a good diversity of this category. And it just takes a lot of familiarity with the mosses and relatives to be able to identify them. Feel free to take that on your own time. So these groups, the mosses are the biggest group, liverworts next up, and then just a few genera of hornworts in Wisconsin. I've got a list here, it's a little bit dated, of the genera of non-vascular land plants. Another way to refer to the non-vascular land plants is to call them these bryophytes. You might see that name come up. And on here, I've put some symbols to indicate where the liverworts are. That's this blue circle with the gold center. Those are liverworts, relatively fewer of those, and very few of the hornworts, 3 hornwort genera highlighted on this list here. So not too much more about the bryophytes there. The seedless vascular plants, these are keyed out in your Wisconsin Flora book. So you could identify these using a guide that otherwise would help you with the seed plants. They're not too diverse, and to identify them, you'd probably want to have some reproductive structures to look at. The 3 categories within this seedless vascular plant category are plants known as lycophytes, plants known as horsetails, and then plants known as ferns. So all these together are Seedless vascular plants, that means they reproduce by spores, and a big difference will be in how those spores are produced and contained on the plant as far as identifying them. So mostly plants in the fern group. Altogether, this whole category is rather small, so 24 genera of fern, 1 genus of horsetail, very distinctive group as we'll see, and 7 genera of lycophytes. I want to just throw this up there as a indicator of what's going on with the ferns and their relatives. I mentioned that they reproduce by spores. And so you would see on a mature plant, potentially you would see these spore producing structures. Spores are really tiny. They're good at getting around just in the air. You can kind of think of them like pollen grains, except when a spore hits the ground, the spore can grow up into its own structure. So I took this image and I modified it. I took away some of the stuff you wouldn't be able to see with your naked eye, and most people would never notice this. But after the spore ends up on suitable land, it goes through some growth and eventually ends up producing a structure that will grow into the next generation of fern. So we'll kind of leave it at that, unless you want to, feel free to ask me if you want to know more. So the lycophytes are often something you could identify based on this kind of elongated cone structure. So it looks like a cone, and inside of there would be the spores. So lycopodium here, diphasiastrum, pretty similar reproductive structures. A little bit different here on this plant called Hupersia, and it's got spore producing structures associated with each of the leaves on this relatively small plant. Sometimes these get mistaken for conifers. They kind of look like little pine trees growing up in the forest understory, and they're not too far off from, let's say, lycopodium here would be pretty close to a seedling juniper or something like that. And so being able to identify them using these spore structures is important. Another feature is the leaves on here. The leaves on the lycophytes are predominantly these kind of triangular scale leaves. So a little bit prickly, sometimes overlapping as in the diphasiastrum. So relatively small triangular leaves, spore producing structures, that would give you the lycophytes. Horsetails, turns out there's only one genus called Equisetum, and this is a very distinctive group, and worldwide it's really just this one genus, Equisetum. So they have a hollow cylindrical stem, and every once in a while there's a node here, and that node may have nothing really going on. There'd be some fine teeth type of leaves on there. Here's a zoom in on the kinds of leaves you might find on the cylindrical collar on this one. You might also see what look like a whorl of leaves. Those are actually side branches coming off of this plant. They don't really turn into anything else. They're actually made up of branches, and they kind of bush up the horsetail like this. You might never see them, or a particular plant you might not see with any cones associated with it. They do all right to continue growing just vegetatively. But when they reproduce, they would produce a cone, again, producing spores, a terminal cone here. So sometimes you see them like this, sometimes you see them like that. There are a few species, so there is one genus, but there are several species of Equisetum. And these are ones you find typically in wet places. And then finally, the ferns. Ferns are diverse locally and also worldwide. Sometimes on the undersides of leaves, you'll see these clusters, these structures that bear, this is actually a structure that's protecting the spore producing structures under it. So looks like there'd be several spore producing structures in each of these. That's again the leaf underside. Another time you might see them in more like a capsule of spores. This is a whole different group of ferns called the grape ferns and relatives. Sometimes the spores are produced, as in this plant, on a separate stalk. So we've got a spore producing stalk here, and then a leaf sort of lower down, something that looks more like a leaf on this plant. Really distinctive. And then these other couple images, I'm just showing you kind of how they develop their leaves, which is helpful for identifying ferns. So we've got leaves that are actually rolled up. So kind of rolled up, and as they grow, they unroll those leaves. This is a plant that typically grows again in wet habitats. In Wisconsin, we see these much more in the north, but you might find them kind of scattered in the right kind of habitat in southern Wisconsin. And one other feature for the ferns is that they've often got pinnately divided leaves and sometimes doubly divided. So this one is pinnately compound, and then each of the leaflets is also lobed. It's not fully divided, but it's lobed down, and you can see that off here. So they're kind of a typical, you're probably familiar with fern leaves. There's your more typical fern leaf, and then there are a few that don't always look exactly like ferns. That's something to get familiar with. All right, moving up through the diversity, we get into the first group of plants now that has seeds. And seed is a result of pollination, and these plants also do pollination. So they produce pollen, the sort of the male component with the sperm cell inside, and ovules, the female component with an egg cell inside. And the technical name for the group that contains the conifers is the gymnosperms. So our local representatives of gymnosperms are the conifers. There are some others worldwide, including like cycads that are members of the gymnosperm group more broadly. And the gymnosperm name means that they have naked seeds. So what that means by naked seeds is that you could get right into these spruce cones there, and there would be a seed protected but not entirely enclosed by these papery bracts or leaves that are associated with that. So the seeds can just fall out really without any tissue breaking to release them. That being said, sometimes cones, when they're before they're mature, they're very well sealed up. So they're not entirely closed, as in like fused tissue, but they can have organs that are tightly pressed against each other to protect the seeds nonetheless. So woody cones, papery cones, large cones, small cones, pretty familiar to you with the conifers, these kind of needly leaves. And then a little bit more bizarre kind of cone production is found in the junipers. These have the common term, we would call these juniper berries. And they're not a fruit, but they function like a fruit. So they're fleshy, they're colorful, they're tasty. And it's a set of tightly pressed bracts, again, so tightly pressed, closed up. Really functions a lot like a fruit, but technically, according to development, it's not fused up in the way that the seeds are contained in fruits in the flowering plants. So a bit of diversity there. Life cycle, as I mentioned, pollen and ovules. And in these groups, the pollen is produced on cones separate from the location where the ovules are produced. So something like a pine cone actually takes a long time to develop after being fertilized. You might take 2 years to develop a pine cone after successfully fertilizing. So pollen fertilizes ovule, the ovulate cone then develops the fertilized ovules into seeds. Those seeds quite often have a wing to them. So we got pollen fertilizing the ovule, and that develops into these seeds with wings on them contained on the woody scale or bract associated with a pine cone. And that goes off to disperse. And when the seed hits the soil, it can germinate and develop into a seedling. So there's our conifer life cycle. Reproductively, I mentioned that the pollen is produced on cones, the ovules are produced on cones, and for the most part, our plants in Wisconsin, these are producing pollen cones and ovule cones on the same plant. So that makes them monoecious. So unisexual reproductive organs, but located in separate parts of the plant. This is something, the distribution of pollen from these pollen cones, something that happens in the early spring. We're pretty well done with it by now in June. But certainly there's a time when these are dispersing so much pollen, you might find it as a yellowy dust on your car, or your driveway or something, lakes. So producing pollen and then receiving the pollen, these are young ovulate cones. They're going to develop into pine cones later in their development, but right now they look rather different, and they're open for receiving those pollen grains to fertilize the ovules inside. This is just a few families of conifers in Wisconsin. So one of those is the pine family. We're going to use family names, these technical scientific names for families. We're also going to end up using scientific names for species and genera. And the scientific name for a family has this official ending ACE, so pronounced ACE, spelled ACEAE. So this is a family that contains pine, the genus Pinus, Pinaceae. And these are some examples. So again, we've got woody cones, needle type of leaves, woody, I should say, or papery. The spruce cones are much more papery than woody. The other family that's pretty big in Wisconsin is called Cupressaceae, the juniper or cedar family. So plants called white cedar, red cedar. The white cedar have rather small woody cones. The junipers, as I showed you before, have these fleshy cones. The leaves can be needle-like or also scale-like. So it kind of depends on the species, and sometimes the same plant can have both scale leaves and pointy, needly leaves. And one thing to note about the white cedar cones is that they have an opposite phyllotaxis, which is kind of, the other ones in the pine family, these have a spiral phyllotaxis. So you can kind of see some spiral patterns in there, and both the pine and the spruce cone, these spirals that go along the side, much more elongate, much larger relative to the white cedar here, or otherwise known as arborvitae, with the opposite bracts on its cones. Okay, so some examples of pollen cones. I think I need to update that. That's it's not showing the pollen cones right now. Spruce there. Pine pollen cones, tamarack or larch pollen cones. Here's a hemlock pollen cone. Typically rather small and often at a time of year when we're not really paying attention to our flowering plants or our gymnosperms. Seed cones, as I said, woody or papery, rather large. The hemlock here is kind of small, but still kind of fitting this pattern of spiral phyllotaxis, kind of woody or papery. In family Cupressaceae, the pollen cones are even tinier, I would say, and often borne at the ends of these branches that have the scale leaves on them, and then also having that opposite phyllotaxis, kind of helpful for identifying them. So white cedar, juniper, tiny, tiny pollen-producing cones. Seed cones, as I mentioned, either these fleshy berry type of cones or woody cones. And last family, not one you typically find in southern Wisconsin growing wild, but people do cultivate them. These are the plants called yew, Y-E-W-U plants in family Taxaceae. Has pollen cones, and the female part of reproduction is one ovule at a time, and that one ovule develops into a seed with this fleshy red covering. Kind of highlighting here also, these are part of the gymnosperm or naked seed group. You can actually see the seed in there. If you get this at the right angle, there's a seed buried in there, and it's just surrounded, not perfectly enclosed, but surrounded by this red fleshy berry that's attractive to animals for dispersal. As far as the distribution of these species, a lot of our conifers are found more north. So black spruce, here's the white cedar. There's a fir tree, and a few of them. So juniper is a little more of a southern, kind of a savanna plant, and then some distributed more evenly throughout. But generally, you're going to find more conifers in the north. As we talk about the biogeography of plants, you find more conifers typically more to the extreme temperate zones. So higher latitudes, more conifers, better at surviving winter, like freezing temperatures, making use of environments that are a little harsher from the temperature standpoint. All right, and then finally, our flowering plants are the most diverse, as I've mentioned. So flowering plants have, of course, flowers and lots of variation in the flowers. These aren't all Wisconsin flowers, but just want to kind of highlight the diversity. So diversity in size, shape, color, orientation, pointing off to the side, flat and open. And a big reason that the flowering plants are so successful is that they can partner with animals to do their pollination. So pretty flowers, attractive flowers are attractive to animals, largely who will do their pollination and help these plants get reproduced. So the flowering plant life cycle, not too different from the conifer life cycles. We still have pollen and ovules, except these happen from the organs we talked about in the flower. So stamens produce pollen that has sperm cells inside, and carpels produce ovules that have egg cells inside, and pollination amounts to pollen making it to the stigma on top of the pistil here. The pollen actually grows down as a tube down into where the ovules are. That's where fertilization happens. And then those fertilized ovules become seeds, and they become seeds contained within fruits. So a little bit different, but a lot of the terms are the same to what we saw with the conifers. Among the flowering plants, there are two big groups, and there's mostly plants you would find would fall into this group called the dicots. So monocots and dicots, this is a term that refers to the way that their seed embryos are put together. So monocots have one embryo leaf and dicots have two embryo leaves. It's not something you would notice, but they are evolutionarily, they're their own groups. They're separate from each other. And so they also have lots of other features that can be helpful for telling them apart. So here we have, again, majority dicots, and then still a good number of monocot genera in Wisconsin. So if you needed to tell our local plants apart, again, kind of helpful for identifying them, the Wisconsin Flora book it doesn't have big divisions for the most part, but it has this one division in the flowering plants between the dicots and the monocots. So if you want to just thumb your way to a group in the book, you would maybe already know that you're looking for a monocot group, and those are alphabetized separate from where the dicots are. And for good reason, they're pretty easy to identify using not only flowering, but also vegetative characteristics. So here they are laid out. These are traits that are, for the most part, useful for identifying these groups. There are some exceptions, and sometimes you just have to learn the exceptions along the way. For the most part, the monocots have parallel leaf venation. So here's a lily with parallel leaf venation. Here's a spiderwort with parallel venation. The grasses belong to this group, and they also have parallel venation. And our dicots, by contrast, have palmate or pinnate venation for the most part. So pinnate venation here in this hawthorn. If you do have flowers, those are also useful for identifying these different groups. The monocots typically have multiples of 3 for their perianth parts. So that would be 3 petals. So this plant here, 1, 2, 3 petals, 1, 2, 3 sepals found on that one. This clintonia has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think I miscounted. There's 6 in there. Here's a better one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So 6 is a multiple of 3. 6 tepals in this plant. And then our dicots, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in this buttercup, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in this hawthorn. So 4s and 5s more typically representative of the dicots. Those are pretty reliable. And then third characteristics, locally our plants, the ones that are trees or shrubs, those are all dicots, and monocots in Wisconsin are not woody plants. So zooming in on the monocots, just kind of maybe familiarize yourself with the big groups. These might be groups you're familiar with already a little bit. Our biggest monocot family is the grass family, Poaceae. Next one up is the lily family, kind of in the broad sense as your Wisconsin Flora book treats it. The lily family, 23 genera. Next up, the orchid family, a little bit rare in general, but diverse. Also, this is an orchid shown here, an orchid flower. Sedges, Cyperaceae, and then 37 other genera making up the rest of diversity. So just on the level of genus categorization, these are how they break down. Dicots, a little more diverse, so more families overall. These are the big families: the sunflower family called Asteraceae, the bean family called Fabaceae, the mustard family called Brassicaceae, the carrot family called Apiaceae, mint family Nullamiaceae, rose family Rosaceae, and then a whole bunch of other families making up the remainder there. So 346 remaining genera in scattered other families. Some of them are just really oddball genera once in a while. And then finally, so we talked about all the different kinds of land plants, and I just want to give some mention to these groups. These are groups that would still be contained within the umbrella of botany, even though they're not within the land plant group. So close relative to land plants are the green algae, including some that are what we call macrophytes, algae that you can see with your naked eye. So these are, this is a plant called Cara. This grows in the water, and it's one that you might run into as you're identifying flowering plants underwater. This is an algae that grows underwater. Other algae, a lot of them are just microscopic, and you wouldn't be able to identify them just casually for the most part. Fungi are historically treated within the umbrella of botany, and they still really are. It turns out that evolutionarily, they're very distant from plants, and they're actually closer relatives of animals than they are of plants. But they share a lot in common with the plants. They are stationary. They reproduce by spores. So still, this field of mycology, or studying fungi, is a pretty close cousin to botany, studying the plants. And then lichen are kind of a subset, I guess, of fungi. Lichens are a symbiotic relationship between fungi and photosynthetic algae, or cyanobacteria. So good to know, not something you could identify with the books that we have for this course, but again, a good set of organisms to get familiar with if you are interested.